Walter White was no ordinary high school chemistry teacher. Sure, he got excited about things like ions and compounds and bonds. He had the same lunch every day. He went home to a wife and son. He even drove the modest family man Pontiac Aztek. But Walter White also had a cough. And he'd cough, sometimes until blood came up or until he passed out. So obviously Walter had a problem. One day Walter went to the doctor. He found out that he had stage 3 inoperable lung cancer. He also found out that the treatment would cost tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. How would a high school chemistry teacher be able to write that bill? And if Walter's on his way out anyway, how could he give his family that debt and take away his salary? Well, this is the basis for AMC's hit show Breaking Bad. And while Walter White is a fictional character, he tells us something about our real character. We all have needs. We are needy people. Here at DTS, we have finances. We got to pay for school and we got to pay for life. We have financial need. We have church, school, family, agape projects. So many things grabbing for our time. So we have needs for strength, for stamina. We also have jobs. Maybe some of us need a job here, or we're looking to when we finish DTS, hoping for that job and not doing full-time ministry wearing a Starbucks apron. So when faced with the reality of our needs, how do we not worry? How do we avoid panic when we realize that we are in fact needy people? What should our mindset be as our stomach grumbles and our bank accounts drain? Well, praise be to God. In His Word, He gives us the answer to that question. And so we're going to look at Mark chapter 8, starting in verse 13. Mark chapter 8, starting in verse 13. But before we get there, while you're flipping there, scrolling there, or trying really hard to remember the passage, let me set the scene for you. At the end of Mark 7, Jesus goes up to a man who's both deaf and mute. He performs a miracle. He makes it so the man can hear and the man can speak. And just like that, Jesus is off teaching crowds, about 4,000 people. And they've listened to him for a few days and they're starting to get hungry. So the disciples bring to him 7 loaves of bread. And Jesus does what Jesus does and multiplies the bread, and he feeds all those people. And Jesus gets in a boat because they're in the Galilean region. And as he's going to a different area in Galilee, the Pharisees see him approaching. And they come out. And they say, Jesus, give us a sign. Not to see if he's the Messiah, the awaited one, but to test him, kind of a gotcha question. And Jesus isn't going to play their game, so he just says no. And he has a deep sigh, and he wonders if they'll understand. And that's where we get to our passage today, Mark 8, starting in verse 13. And in this passage, we first see the disciples worry that their needs will not be met. The disciples worry that their needs will not be met. And then we see Jesus rebuke the disciples for not understanding who he is. Jesus rebuked the disciples for not understanding who he is. So the first thing we see is the worry. The disciples worry that their needs won't be met. Or Jesus' followers fret for food. And in verse 13, the scene is beginning to change. But in verse 14, notice the predicament that the disciples are in. So starting in verse 13. Leaving them, he again embarked and went away to the other side. And they, the disciples, had forgotten to take bread. It did not have more than 1 loaf in the boat with them. So we see the issue. There's only 1 loaf for 13 people, the disciples plus Jesus. And you can imagine, as Jesus performed these miracles, that all the disciples thought, the other guy was going to get it. Oh, John will get it. No, it's okay, Peter's got it. No, Thomas has got it. And the end result is there's only one loaf of bread. So Jesus, as he's with the disciples, he sees this dynamic playing out. He gives a rather peculiar warning in verse 15. Pretty strange. And he, Jesus, was giving orders to them saying, "Watch out. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." So Jesus warned the disciples not to be a kitchen ingredient. If somebody came up to me and said, "Hey, Ryan, beware of the leaven of atheists," or "beware of the leaven of the worldly," I might see where they're going, but I'd look at them like they're crazy. So what did Jesus mean by this leaven? Well, in the Torah, leaven was not permitted in the Israelites' households during Passover. And throughout Scripture, it has this negative connotation. So when Jesus says, "Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Herod," they don't discern who Jesus is. They are denying recognizing who he is or who his person is. So it's a little bit of foreshadowing. We see Jesus saying, don't have that leaven of denial of who I am. And so it makes sense because Jesus is their master. They're following him. The disciple would say, "You're right, Jesus. One loaf of bread, no worries." But in verse 16, that's not quite the reaction we get. In verse 16, they, the disciples, began to discuss with one another the fact that they had no bread. So they don't get it. The disciples don't understand what's going on. And this is quite a low point for the disciples. I mean, they just witnessed Jesus feed 4,000 people with 7 loaves of bread. What I call the greatest meal deal of all time. And the Pharisees didn't get any signs. The disciples got sign after sign after sign after sign. And yet they're still concerned that they'll be hungry with one loaf when there's 13 people. Fundamentally, they're not understanding who Jesus is. They're not understanding his kingdom power and his role as the Messiah. So the second thing we see then is Jesus' rebuke, or is his response to this. And Jesus rebukes the disciples for not understanding who he is. Or Jesus corrects his followers for not seeing him as their breadwinner. Now, if Eugene Peterson, if you ever watch this online, if you ever see this, you can rename your subsection of the message, "Jesus Schools the Disciples," because he gives them one heck of a rebuke. And he does it by actually asking 8 rhetorical questions. And so we'll dig into some of these questions. In verse 17, and Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why do you discuss the fact that you have no bread? Do you not see or understand? Do you have a hardened heart?" Ouch. That phrase right there, "do you have a hardened heart?" Jesus has used that phrase to describe the Pharisees. And now he's using that phrase to describe the disciples. Because the reality is right now the disciples are no better off than the Pharisees. Neither group understands who Jesus is or sees him as God, as the one who provides. And the next question, the next 2 questions Jesus asks are just dripping with irony. See if you can spot it and understand why. Verse 18, "Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear?" So here we see Mark, our narrator, setting up this punch that the disciples don't understand who Jesus is. Because at the end of chapter 7, Jesus heals a man who is deaf, causing him to hear. And immediately following this, before we get to chapter 9, Jesus is going to heal a man who is blind, enabling him to see. Yet the disciples do not see, or they do not hear, or recognize who Christ is. And Jesus ends this set of questions by causing the disciples to recall some things from memory. End of verse 18. "And do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many baskets full of broken pieces you picked up?" And they said to him, 12. "And when I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many large baskets full of broken pieces did you pick up?" And they said 7. And he was saying to them, "Do you still not understand?" So that ends Jesus' barrage of questions, but that last one's the real stinger. Do you still not understand? The point has been made. The disciples didn't have a lapse of memory. Their memory wasn't foggy because they recalled facts of how many leftovers they picked up. The fact was they missed the significance entirely. They had the data, but they had no meaning that Jesus is the one who will provide for their needs, that Jesus is their provider. He's the giver of gifts and the gift of the giver, the provider and the provision, the bread and the baker. And what's true of the disciples back then is true of us today. True disciples of Christ understand and see him as their provider. So how do we take this episode of the disciples worrying that their needs won't be met, and Jesus rebuking the disciples for not understanding who he is? How do we take this and apply it to our lives today? Well, quite obviously, we need to see God as our provider. We must not do what the disciples did. And while it's easy to rag on them and trash the disciples, we can really see ourselves in them. We too are following after Jesus, following after his teaching. We've seen his work in our lives and in the lives of those around us. And as we slip on that leather sandal, Jesus' words ring harrowingly in our heads. Do you not see? Do you still not understand? So to combat this, we need to get a little R and R. And I'm not talking about rest and relaxation, those two things you did a long time ago before you came here to DTS. I'm talking about we need to remember and reflect. Remember and reflect. I know we all might not be arts and craftsy in here, but bear with me. March starts tomorrow. And throughout the month of March, my challenge to you is to write down every time God has provided, he's pulled through, he's answered prayer. Write these on little scraps of paper and keep them in a cup or a jar on your dresser or on your counter, someplace that you walk by regularly. This will help you remember what Jesus has done. Because in our passage, Jesus himself asked the disciples to remember what he has done. And then at the end of the month, you take these little scraps of paper and you have a time of prayer and thanksgiving to reflect on what God has done and to truly see him as the one who provides for you, the one who answers prayer, the one who pulls through. I know it might sound cheesy, but I've done it in my own life. My parents forced me to. But it was huge for my growth and contentment in seeing God as the one who provides for all of my needs. The reality is we are needy people. We all have needs, and while they might be different, they're still there. And this passage shows us that we are to see God as the provider for those needs, to remember and reflect. Remember what he has done and reflect on who he is. Because he's been with us in the bad times and the good times, in the high, the low, in sickness and in health. And as we remember what he has done, we also look to what will come, that he is our provider for tomorrow, that he is our provider for the next month, and that he is our provider for all of eternity. Thank you.